Hello and welcome to Father Spitzer's Universe at the intersection of faith and reason, and I'm Doug Keck, your host, and we're coming to you live from our EWTN studios at the heart of EWTN in Irondale, Alabama, where it all began with Mother Angelica. This is the mothership, as we would say, and the topic for today for Father Spitzer is evidence of God's existence. The question is, why do we have the impression that all scientists are atheists, or are they? Let's see what Father Spitzer has to say about that. Get in on the conversation. Email us questions at spitzer'suniverse@ewtn.com. Post your questions on Facebook at facebook.com/EWTN online, hashtag FSUniverse, and send us a tweet. You can do that at twitter.com/EWTN, hashtag FSUniverse for Father Spitzer. And of course, always go to the Magis Center website. It's magiscenter.com, as well as, of course, EWTN's website, EWTN.com. And since this is the mothership, we want to mention Mother's book before we talk to Father Spitzer. Again, flying off the shelves, Answers Not Promises, really for a whole new generation. This is a reprint, a new edition of a 30-year-old work by Mother Angelica, straightforward solutions to life's puzzling problems, featuring an all-new foreword by our own chaplain, Father Joseph Mary Wolfe, one of the people who really knew her best. Go to EWTNRC.com for Answers Not Promises. Now let's go for some more answers to Father Spitzer. Hey, welcome back. It's been a quick week, I have to say. It's great to see you, though.
Great to see you, Doug.
Now let me ask you, are you planning on doing any impressions of any atheists on this particular program?
No, but I'm sure the thought of some of those atheists is going to come up during this program, but no impressions this time. We'll have to save it for dinner next time we're together.
Right. Well, let me ask you, I was looking up some stuff, as we get some of our questions up from our viewers, and one of the articles I saw jump out at me on the web was a question a particular person put forward. They say, they believe that science and religion are in conflict from time to time. This person ridicules religious dogma, and they really see that because science holds that no idea is sacred, it's inevitable that it draws people away from religion. And there seemed to be also this sense in what I was reading through, the idea that since, in a way, religion requires faith or dogma where you have to believe things that can't be proven, that runs totally contrary to science. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously there's two questions placed in there. The first one is, are faith and science, completely contradictory? And the answer to that is no. They're not contradictory. Yes, they have very different methods. One is dependent upon the self-revelation of God, and one requires faith. That would be religion. And another one is really looking at an explanatory or descriptive method that's generally empirical, mathematical, and has its precise way of dealing with things. But the conclusions themselves are not opposed at all. And in previous programs, I've talked about the evidence for God, from contemporary science. So I've talked about that Board of Alenkin and Guth proof that show not only that our universe would need a beginning, but a multiverse would need a beginning. Indeed, a universe in the higher dimensional space of string theory would need a beginning. Indeed, it seems like every known configurable universal structure that we could have requires a beginning according to the Board of Alenkin and Guth proof, which means that it is highly likely that physical reality itself needed a beginning, no matter what configuration it's in. Multiverse, right? Higher dimensional space universe and string theory are just plain our own universe. So whatever the case may be, if physical reality needs a beginning, obviously, prior to that beginning, physical reality was nothing. And if physical reality was nothing, it could only do nothing. Therefore, when it was nothing, it could not have moved itself from nothing to something, because it could only do nothing because it was nothing. And therefore, something else which exists outside the universe, something else which is fundamentally beyond the universe, creates the universe as a whole with its physical time and space, with its constants and laws, with its mass and energy, creates the entire thing out of nothing as a whole. And that's something else outside or beyond the universe which creates it, we call a creator or God. Now, this is, I'm not citing something from faith, right? This is the consequence of the Borda-Vilenkin and Guth proof. It's also the consequence of the entropy evidence, which I haven't discussed. And you put it together with the consequences of nothing, being prior to the beginning. Now, there are a lot of people like Stephen Hawking who claim that nothing is really not nothing, that nothing is really the laws of gravitation or something of that nature. But this is silliness, and I have analyzed this in many an article on magiscenter.com, M-A-G-I-S center.com. There's an entire videotape on why nothing is not just empty space, why nothing is not a zero energy configuration of a quantum field, why nothing is not, an energy configuration, false vacuum of a quantum field, why nothing is not the laws of gravitation. Nothing is just plain old nothing, and we shouldn't be sneaking something into nothing and calling it nothing. When physical reality was nothing, it was nothing. You combine these conclusions from entropy, Borda-Vilenkin and Guth proof, and the simple metaphysics of nothing, you're going to wind up getting very close to a creator. And of course, there's much fine-tuning evidence, which we may discuss in this program, may not discuss in this program, that also I've discussed on magiscenter.com, that gives you the fine-tuning evidence for why that creator would be intelligent, indeed super intelligent. And I might just conclude with Fred Hoyle, who used to be the greatest atheistic gadfly who ever lived, Sir Fred Hoyle. Finally, of course, Hoyle at one point in his life declares, right after he's seen, some coincidences that are just too much for him to bear, and he phrases it this way: I don't think that there are any blind forces worth speaking about. It seems to me that there must be some super calculating, super intellect which has monkeyed with the constants of physics and those of chemistry and biology as well. I consider this conclusion to be beyond the shadow of a doubt. Now that came from, obviously, a converted Fred Hoyle, who actually looked at the scientific evidence and found this conclusion. Now, we can talk about this at length maybe later in the program.
I think what we want to talk about
if listeners have specific
questions.
I
think what we want to talk about is the whole idea is, are scientists basically atheists? Is working in the science field demanding that someone be an atheist? A particular Lawrence Krauss wrote, commitment to open questioning is deeply tied to the fact that science is an atheistic enterprise. And we also have a comment here from somebody at Facebook. Let me read this for you. The scientific community has to associate with atheism because it supports scientific ideas. It's a world where nothing is accepted without materialistic proof. And this is from Mario. We've been talking a little bit about that. So does it just be a matter of fact that, if I'm going to be a real scientist and really rely on my scientific proofs, I have to be an atheist, or if I'm not an atheist, maybe I'm an agnostic?
Well, here's three quick clues. Number one, with respect to your view, Mario, that's really not an atheistic view. That's an agnostic view. Scientists don't have to be atheists. That expresses a belief that God does not exist. That, nevertheless, is a belief. And of course, scientists, if you want to remain perfectly objective, if you're claiming that God does not exist, my immediate claim is, this can't be a scientific opinion. Where's the evidence that God does not exist? You cannot disprove the existence of God, Mario. It's absolutely impossible. It's on my website. I have the whole argument there. You can't disprove it empirically. You can't disprove it a prioristically. You can't disprove it scientifically. It's beyond scientific methodology. It's beyond empirical proof. It's beyond rational proof. You can't disprove God's existence. So let's take the first assumption very, very clearly here. The first thing is science cannot be atheistic, because that expresses a belief for which there is no scientific evidence, and there can be no scientific evidence. What you probably mean to say is that science must be agnostic. That is to say, don't know on the basis of science. Now, does every scientist have to say, I don't know whether God exists? Does every scientist have to say, I preclude God from my realm of belief in order to be a scientist? Of course not. First of all, 45% of bench scientists are believers in God. Let me repeat that. 45% of bench scientists are believers in God, and there is very good evidence for that. Very good polling evidence for that, which pretty much suggests that. And the reason that they're believers in God is not simply because they are, believers through their faith, but also because they find it commensurate with science. They find a beginning commensurate with science. They find the idea of intelligence within creation commensurate with science. This in turn is commensurate with their belief in God, and that's why they believe in God. They're not being stupid. So the answer again is, do all scientists have to be agnostics? Of course not. Scientists only need to be agnostic in the sense of not knowing when they don't know the ultimate result of a scientific question. That doesn't mean that they can't see congruities between their scientific data, between an explanation for scientific data that goes beyond the universe, right? There's congruities between those things, right? And finally, with their religious faith itself. So scientists, of course, can have religious faith. Scientists frequently do have religious faith. Like almost 45% of the time they do. The main thing is, well, what about that other 55%? Are they all atheists? And the answer is no. The other 55% are not atheists. Most of them say that they're agnostics. That is to say, they don't know, and because they can't get perfect scientific evidence for it, and they won't be able to, but they can get substantial scientific evidence for their belief if they want to. And of course, the other part who are atheists, they are militant indeed, and that's Lawrence Krauss. And Lawrence Krauss takes a very minority opinion on this matter, and so also do a few other people like Richard Dawkins, who are like him. So for all intents and purposes, this is not the majority opinion in science. As a matter of fact, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the biggest scientific association in the United States, they have an entire division that's devoted to faith and science. Mario, if you have to be an atheist in order to be a scientist, why would the AAAS have a whole division devoted to theology and science, or faith and science? How do you explain the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at Berkeley, right? The CTNS. How do you explain IRAS, the Institute for Religion and Science, right? That has its important journal Zygon. How do you explain? We're talking about one after the next of these organizations with very good scientists. By the way, how in the world could you have a papal Academy of Sciences that has a whole bunch of Nobel Prize winners in it? Just click on your Google Papal Academy of Sciences. Just take a look at who belongs to that group. I'm assuming that if they belong to the Papal Academy, they're somehow associated with Catholicism, and if so, they're associated with God. So what do I think of Lawrence Krauss's opinion? Not much.
Okay.
It's not just a minority opinion. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay,
and for all intents and purposes, they're not conflictual. But,
okay.
But you get my
right,
drift.
exactly. And let me also mention this to you. I was looking online. There was a study I found by Elaine Eklund and Christopher Scheitel, possibly. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. But they did a study on disbelief in God by academics. And it basically had physics 40%, chemistry 26%, biology 41%, and then they went into some of the softer sciences. They said overall 31.2%. But you know what I thought was really interesting, I guess because anybody could argue with these statistics, was the idea that their conclusion was it is true that scientists believe less in the existence of God than the general public of the United States. However, the recent study reveals that the most important factors in belief were related to upbringing, family status, and not the area of expertise. Is that surprising?
No, it's not surprising to me at all, because I really don't see a conflict between faith and science. As I said, there's so much evidence from science for creation, for intelligent creation, and for a soul. We've talked on this program before about near-death experiences and the good peer-reviewed medical studies of those near-death experiences. There's so much evidence out there right now that's coming through that any scientist who really wants to confirm their faith according to their upbringing is generally going to have more than enough evidence to confirm their faith from the vantage point of science. There is really no need to interrupt. I agree with the results of that study that many of the scientists who do not have faith either were not brought up in an environment of faith, or alternatively, they had parents maybe who had a very hard view of God, that the child, now become a scientist, has rejected. So God is a cruel person. God doesn't care about our salvation. God is somebody who just basically throws the world into existence and makes people suffer. But it's a very unnuanced view of God, or a very cruel notion of God. And sometimes when they're given that view of God from either their childhood religion or their parents, they do walk off and reject God pretty much in toto. So yes, that's definitely there.
What was also interested in this study, I thought, was the point they made that the correlation, you would tend to think sometimes the high-end, like physics, chemistry, biology, astrophysics, these are the kind of things people would talk about and think, well, these scientists, they're really dealing with these kind of realities, and so you can understand why they can't find the facts. But they were pointing out the fact that sociology, economics, political science, psychology, that those social sciences have the same percentages. And it was an interesting idea that the people went into that had that much, where their particular scientific function wouldn't seem to have any relationship to understanding whether there was or wasn't a God.
Yeah. In fact, frequently enough, sometimes, people in literature have higher incidence of atheism than people in the natural sciences, particularly physics and physical chemistry. And so that's a kind of an interesting thing. The other thing that's rather interesting too is that engineers have a remarkably high rate of faith. Again, a very hard discipline. In terms of knowing your math and your physics. If you don't, the bridge comes down. The point is pretty clear that there is not a correlation between hard science or hard engineering on the one hand, and literature, philosophy, or history or whatever or sociology on the other hand, psychology. So for all intents and purposes, it really does more depend on what the personal feelings are of a person, the way in which they were raised, or maybe some suffering that they couldn't deal with properly, and so forth.
Right, exactly. In some ways you see that there's more projection going on than maybe people like to admit. With that, we're going to take a break. Much more ahead with Father Spitzer as we talk to him about whether scientists are atheists or not. The answers may surprise you as we continue. Also, don't forget Finding True Happiness, Satisfying Our Restless Hearts, a wonderful book by Father Spitzer, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Stay with us. And thank you again for staying with us here on Father Spitzer's Universe as we explore the concept of, are scientists atheists in general? The answers can be surprising as we talk here with Father Spitzer. Father Spitzer, before I get to a question, I also wanted to mention a study I saw from Pew that made an interesting point. It said that the data on the Pew Research survey showed that the percentages of believers and unbelievers among scientists was actually unchanged from about 100 years ago. So that's kind of interesting.
That's correct.
That's kind of interesting, because we would tend to think, well, it's because we know so much more now. That's why everybody's that way. So that kind of reinforces the point you were making earlier.
Yeah, that's right. And in his book, The Language of God, Francis Collins, who is really writing about DNA and the handwriting of God in the genetic code, he actually cites some of those early surveys and compares them to surveys today. And of course, there he shows pretty conclusively that the amount of atheism has certainly not increased at all. Even over the last 100 years. So right. The Pew survey completely agrees with Collins.
That's very interesting. Okay, here's a question for you, tying into our theme about atheism and scientists. Hi, Father. Would you say that much of the cause for many scientists being atheists comes down to ego and arrogance? Is there a fear that faith in something greater, than themselves, would make them appear not as credible or intelligent? That's an interesting opinion.
Yeah, I think there's that plays a part in some, but I would say it's pretty much a minority. Are what I would call the Lawrence Krauss, Richard Dawkins, obstreperous, kind of scientific atheist. Now, there's a lot of ego there. I mean, tremendous amount of ego and tremendous amount of arrogance, tremendous amount of leaving out of evidence, tremendous amount of rhetorical flourish that leads to very bad argumentation. Now that, I would say, is definitely, there's ego and arrogance there for sure. Now, for a large number of scientists, as I said, we're talking about here, let's just split it up and just say, the group that have not declared themselves to be theists. So if, let's say that 45% of the scientists have declared themselves to be theists, what about this group that has not declared? As I said, many of them are no doubt agnostics. But in my view, many of them also are people who are theists, but they won't declare themselves to be theists. And the reason they won't is precisely what you just said. They're fearful. And of course, they're fearful of what? They're fearful of not getting promoted. They're fearful of not getting a research grant. They're fearful of not getting tenure. They're fearful of not getting ahead in the academic world because somebody above them might, interpret their faith commitment, to be, somehow, a cause celeb for them not being scientifically open. So yes, there is a lot of fear. Mm-hmm. I don't equate that fear, though, with ego or arrogance. It's a different kind of thing. It's very much, a fear of not getting ahead in mm-hmm. one's career. So, it's, as they say, they would rather remain silent, and move ahead, but they are by no means atheists, and they aren't even agnostics. They are what I call the theists who are in the weeds. And now some of the polls maybe that were done by Eklund and others may represent that, and that may explain why mm-hmm. in the polls that Francis Collins and others used, 45% of bench scientists are professed theists, whereas Eklund found, that only, between 30 and 41% were actually unbelievers. Maybe somewhere in that range, you have that group of people who are theists, but they will not profess themselves to be so for fear of some kind of reprisal. And believe me, there are reprisals that can absolutely occur both in the lab setting and in the academic setting.
And we're seeing, actually, it's getting, in that way, it's getting much, much worse. I mean, across the board in the sense of what someone is able to put forward without being attacked or called a Luddite. Here's a question that kind of relates to science, but again, kind of more the soft science. And Sigmund Freud, this comes from an email, Sigmund Freud believed in a correlation between religious practice and mental illness, particularly with obsessive actions. To him, the mere idea of the existence of God is wishful thinking. Please talk about this. Alvin from Virginia. Okay, this isn't the hard science now, a little more the soft science idea. Now, a lot of Freud's opinions have been debunked even by the psychiatry these days, but what about that?
Yeah, you're correct, Alan. In his book, The Future of an Illusion, Freud did actually manifest this opinion, and it's caused a great deal of difficulty in our culture today. But the opinion he manifested was that religion essentially was some kind of wishful thinking. And it was not just wishful thinking, it was kind of a wishful thinking that goes back to almost our ancestors. And of course, he was dependent on a philosopher by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach for that. And Feuerbach, by the way, did not have very good studies. This is kind of an opinion that was asserted by Feuerbach. Freud picks it up and says, yeah, there was lightning, and then, the primitive people got scared, so they invented God, to deal with the lightning that they couldn't control. But, and we'll talk about, whether this is a valid response or not. But Freud extends it even further. He extends it to obsessive compulsive disorder, and sees the guilt that people feel from religious feeling, attributes that also to wishful thinking. But there's actual variance in there because, hey, wait a minute, if religion is wishful thinking, then how come it's making people fearful and creating obsessive compulsive disorders and negative guilt? You can't have it both ways, Freud. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Now, all of these views of Freud, by the way, were redressed. So the main thing to remember, I'm just going to talk about three figures who really responded to Freud, and it's very important. And I wrote a book called The Soul's Upward Yearning, and if you want to see these studies in their depth, go to chapters 1 through 3 of my book, The Soul's Upward Yearning. But number one person to address it is Freud's own student, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung essentially said, wait a minute here, I don't see this at all. I don't see that human beings are dreaming up God as a response to uncontrollable natural urges or uncontrollable fears that they have within them. He said that he thought religion was actually an irreducible sense of the sacred. That in a book called Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and in his Yale lectures on religion and psychology, Jung kind of says forthwith in response to Freud, I don't think you have it right at all. You may have been my teacher, but you are not accounting for the genuine source of religion, which is people's interior sense of the sacred, people's interior sense of the holy, people's interior sense that there is some kind of a spiritual, transcendent being in their lives that they're interacting with, and they have feelings and thoughts and intuitions of that being as if it were present to their interior. That irreducible religious feeling and intuition and awareness, that's the true origin of religion, not the response to fear as a compulsion. Then a second guy comes along by the name of Rudolf Otto, who writes a very seminal and important book called The Idea of the Holy. Still available today, Oxford University Press. A very, very excellent study. And what he shows is that 98% of the people in the world actually, he studies all kinds of religions, all kinds of religious people, but he's not just doing a Pew survey. By the way, the Pew survey shows even today that 84% of the people in the world are religious, and just about 25 years ago, that percentage was near to 90% of the world was religious. So, Otto is not just, speaking off the cuff here. What Otto is trying to say, well, what is this numinous experience? And he says, well, it's an experience first and foremost of mystery. It is an experience of what he calls a mysterium tremendum, something within it. It's above us, of course. It's bigger than us, right? It's uncontrollable by us. At one point, it fascinates us. At another point, it kind of scares us. At one point, it's drawing us into itself. Yet at another point, we know it's uncontrollable. But we put it together, and this numinous experience kind of gives us this sense of intense fascination, this intense mystery, this intense awareness within ourselves that the holy and the sacred are there. And that is intrinsic to the religious instinct of people all over the world. Now, of course, in modern culture, we tend to repress it. But just take a look at children. Do children have the numinous experience before some adult comes along and tries to pound it out of them? Absolutely they do. Take a look at a book by Robert Coles from Harvard University on psychology, and he's called The Spiritual Life of Children. And just take a look at the evidence that the numinous or the sacred is present as a religious kind of intuition that's fundamental to children. And if you allow it to be fundamental into adulthood, which most cultures do, of course, there are some subcultures in the United States and Europe that don't allow this to happen, right? They try and drum it out of people at adolescence, right, through the academic establishment or something else. But if you allow it to happen, people are naturally religious because the numinous experience is there. But the most important thing that Otto found is that the numinous experience, by the way, correlating his studies with the great American psychologist William James, found that the numinous experience was irreducible. It was not what Freud thought, that it was a function of a reaction to fear of the uncontrollable, to fear of interior intuitions or natural forces outside of me that were uncontrollable. But it was an irreducible sense of the mysterious, the fascinating, the sacred, the beautiful. Then a third thinker comes along, and this guy's name is Mircea Eliade. The guy's a genius. And essentially, he's a Romanian guy, brilliant guy. By the way, he edits all by himself the entire Macmillan Encyclopedia of Religion. Now, here is a guy who really knows what he's talking about in terms of the diversification of religion and its expression and how it works. I mean, Feuerbach, are you kidding me? Feuerbach didn't know anything. Feuerbach studied absolutely, very little of diverse religions. Freud studied very little, right? These were hip-shoot opinions, the worst kind. The key thing is Eliade comes forward with this book called The Sacred and the Profane and 16 other books that are exceedingly important. But the one thing that Eliade is saying is, hey, Rudolf Otto was right about the numinous. It's present in every religion in the world. And here's how it expresses itself. It expresses itself in the sacred. Because we have this sense of mystery, this sense of fascination, this sense of being in communion with a God who's beyond us but invites us into himself, a God that is at once kind of scary and friendly, a God, right, that is, a tremendum almost. Because of that, what do? We start pursuing religious rituals. religious rites. We have myths. Now, there's a whole thing about this and why it is. We gather together as a community around our symbols, our rituals, our rites, because we want a communitarian and exterior expression of the numinous experience, which is fundamental and irreducible within us. The evidence is overwhelming. I mean, are you kidding? Who believes Freud anymore? Who's read anything, studied anything? His view at best of religion in the future of an illusion, I think, is naive. At best, it is naive. And at worst, it's irresponsibly hostile.
Well, do you think...
Anyway, I leave it to...
The part of the problem we have, too, is kind of... I think of Feuerbach as kind of like being a T-shirt expression. I think I remember hearing from him it was supposed to be the idea... We were not made in God's image. We made God in our image. And that became the little catchphrase.
Yeah, the old catchphrase, but of course it gets reversed all the time by the catchphrase, God is dead, sign Nietzsche. Right. And then, of course, Nietzsche is dead, sign God. Right. That's kind of the reversal. Right. And, God's going to get the last word. Right. And of course, our kids still suffer because of the Freud, deal. I mean, honestly, the kids don't, I'm talking about high school kids here. High school kids, they're scared of having their friends accuse them of being naive or needing a crutch, or some kind of cowardice involved in their belief in God. So they abandon God, in a sense, or they leave God alone because they don't want to give the impression that they're cowards, that they need this crutch. But in point of fact, generation after generation, religious people have shown themselves to be incredibly courageous. Courageous in their faith, courageous in standing up to tyranny, courageous in standing for the rights of widows and orphans and the unjust. Where did laws come from? I mean, do you think the prophets had a great time? I mean, these guys were battered. I mean, because of their faith. Not faith that controlled fear. They were above fear. This was a faith that knew of God and God speaking to them, and they spoke out against the world, and they conquered their fears, and they engaged their fear even to the point of their deaths. This is so frequent in the church, in the whole cause of our martyrs, right? Our martyrs are people who are not avoiding fear, who are not little cowardice, sniveling little people. They were incredibly strong people in the faith in Jesus Christ, and they gave their lives as an example not only of their faith, but an example for the world of what the world needs before it turns itself upside down.
And we hope that EWTN does that point. So we're going to have to take a break. When we come back, we'll finish that point. Sorry. We're up against the hard break. Thank you so much, Father. Stay with us. We also want to mention that God So Loved the World, a wonderful book by Father, which gives you the right perspective on a way of thinking about the transcendent and destiny from the revelation of Jesus by Father Spitzer, EWTNRC.com. It's God So Loved the World. We'll hurry back. Stay with us. Atheism and scientists. This is Father Spitzer's Universe, and just to mention a couple of wonderful books, Finding True Happiness, as I alluded to earlier by Father Spitzer, and also one that's very relevant to our discussions today, The Soul's Upward Yearning, also available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, both EWTNRC.com. Check that out. Okay, Father Spitzer, as we go to our next question, I saw a quote here that you might like, and maybe you've mentioned before, from Albert Einstein, who said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind."
Yeah. I think that expresses the precise opposite view of the one that we were disputing earlier. So I think this is wonderful. And of course, I think there's a great deal of truth to it. I think, what can science do without religion? Well, typically science cannot formulate ideals, right? That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to give a correct scientific description and explanation of the physical universe. So what can't science do? It can't do ideals for you, right? It can't do, moral principles for you. It can't give you an ethical methodology. It can't comment per se on how to believe in God, how to worship God, how to trust in God. These are all things beyond science. Now, I think science can give evidence for God, but once it gives evidence for God, I think science can also give a description of a kind of creator that you would need. You'd need, a creator outside of space and time, which was highly intelligent. And that I think, metaphysics can also give you a unique, unrestricted, act of thinking, which is the constant creator of all else that is. I think you could get to that point with reason, science, philosophy, metaphysics. But I think once you hit that, science can't give you how to worship, how to find your transcendent identity, how to know God, whether God actually is going to grace you in this life or not grace you, redeem your suffering, not redeem your suffering. Does God inspire us? Does He guide us? Does He not inspire us? Does He not guide us? Does God hate us? Does God love us? Right? Science can't comment on it. It's beyond its methodology. It's beyond its empirical methodological reach. It can't comment. So Einstein's correct in a way. Science can give us a just wonderful knowledge. But what are we going to do with all that wonderful knowledge? What's going to be the right or the wrong we do with it? Are we going to act for some transcendent end, or are we just going to be materialists? Can't tell. Does God love us or hate us? Can't tell. What kinds of ideals will we shoot for? Can't tell. What is right or wrong? Can't tell from science, but you can from religion, and you can from the philosophical interpretation of religion, and there is where you have that important complementary step. Now, for Einstein, of course, religion without science, we would put it today, faith without reason, right, could lead you down some pretty blind alleys, right? So we know that there are a lot of people, who have faith, but they don't coordinate it with reason, right? And what they wind up with is kind of let's face it, an anti-scientific view of the world, which they attribute to their religion. Totally unnecessary, but they do. Sometimes people, they have a great deal of faith, but they have no reason whatsoever, and so, they're not looking at the reasonable consequences of their action. As St. Thomas Aquinas would say, right, you have all this faith, but without reason, you don't have prudence. And without prudence, you don't have wisdom. And boy, you can make some big mistakes. You could torture people and think, well, that's what my religion required. I must be okay, Or you could wind up saying, to somebody, well, I'm afraid, I'm just going to have to dunk you under the water until you give up your witchcraft-looking practices. Oops, we killed you. Well, it's part and parcel of what has to happen, right? So you have to have some kind of reason integrated with your faith. Prudence must be an essential part of faith because, of course, when the two of them are together, they liberate each other. As St. Thomas Aquinas implies continuously, the heart liberates the mind. In other words, faith through the heart liberates our minds to see the transcendent, to see the ideals, to see the principles and the morals, but the mind also liberates the heart. The mind helps us to function, to regulate ourselves, to know the proper use of faith versus an extreme use of faith, to know the proper way in which we must view God. Because there's all kinds of, right? You can't just take biblical verses. You got to have some methodology to interpret
right,
the biblical
or
verses.
verses from the Quran or from something else, and we're seeing sometimes the impact of exactly what you're talking about when you're not getting the appropriate balance in there that obviously the Catholic Church is promoting. Here, we got so many emails in only a few minutes. Let me get to a couple of things. Dear Father Spitzer, your description of the agnostic from a program we did a few weeks ago describes my son perfectly, who committed suicide. His depression and anxiety is our only explanation for his death. Could a belief in God have prevented this? Are agnostics more likely to commit suicide? What happens when an agnostic dies? Yours truly, okay? And we obviously pass along our condolences.
Well, when an agnostic dies, I still believe that that agnostic is going to be loved by God and judged by God, according, to what he was capable of doing. And I think God's judgment is very good. But I do think repentance is necessary, and I think repentance can occur, even, after death. There is, that sense of praying for the dead in the church, that somehow, that there can be some sense that God will, judge them mercifully, even in the midst of suicide. And I truly believe that. I think a mortal sin, requires sufficient reflection and full consent of the will. No question about it. Suicide is very much grievous matter, but I also believe at the same moment that you have to be able to sufficiently reflect on what you are doing and understand that, and that you have to have full consent of the will, which means no impediments to the free use of the will. I mean, a person who's going to commit suicide, I can think of 20 impediments to the free use of the will that they're likely to have, including acute depression. Most people don't commit suicide out of resentment. They really do commit suicide out of depression, and that's an impediment to the free use of the will, to which God's judgment can certainly turn in mercy. But getting to the point at hand, do agnostics have a harder time dealing with life, as you say? Could agnosticism itself or atheism itself lead to depression? The answer is unequivocally yes. Go back to the Kanita Dervik study, which I cited in that book, The Soul's Upward Yearning. This was a 2004 study that was, she reported it with 10 other co-authors of the study in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which is the journal for the American Psychiatric Association. This is the basic end result of that study. She compared non-religiously affiliated people to religiously affiliated people, specifically with respect to suicide rates, but found the following: that non-religiously affiliated people, this is non-religiously, right? They don't have religion, belief in religion, which could be agnostic, atheistic, right? Non-religiously affiliated people had much higher incidence of suicide attempts, much higher incidence of successful suicides, much higher incidence of impulse aggressivity, much higher incidence of depression, despondency, and meaninglessness, much higher incidence of substance abuse, and much higher incidence of familial tensions. Are you kidding me? I think perhaps the most important area that determines, right, we're not talking about a person right now who's had clinical depression, person who has some biochemical imbalance, a person who has post-traumatic stress disorder. Put all that aside for a moment. Just take a normal person right now for the time being who doesn't have those problems, which are, they happen. Of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, chemical imbalances can happen, at the time of menopause or at the time of puberty. Also, of course, we can have a variety of traumas that can affect people adversely. Putting that aside, though, what I think the Dervik study is showing is that religion is one of the most important factors, if not the most important factor in determining whether a person will be depressed or happy, will have meaning or sense of meaninglessness, will have impulse aggressivity or control over their aggressions, will have good family structure versus having challenged family structure, substance abuse problems, non-substance abuse problems, and ultimately suicide versus moving beyond suicide, even if they're tempted to do so. Religion is important. Now let's bring those other factors back on the table. Can religion help people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes, absolutely, in the same positive ways that the Dervick study shows. Can religion help people who are suffering from chemical imbalances? Yes, they can. They're still going to have depression, but religion can help them through the depression. Yes, taking medication can help them through the depression as well, if it's attributable to a chemical imbalance. Yes, there are certain kinds of medications that can help somebody who has PTSD to go through and help with their religion. So you combine religion with some of these medical agents. They are, it's a very, very good combination, helpful combination that can move away from depression. So in answer to your question, yes, religion is exceedingly important in dealing with depression. But in the second part of your question, is God going to treat somebody badly? I think really God has, He is the father of the prodigal son. He is Jesus' Abba. I think, what the church defines in terms of sufficient reflection, full consent of the will, says there's plenty of hope for your son, even if in a kind of, agnostic or atheistic depression, he moved towards suicide. I think God can see, that in that depression, there may have been a very severe challenge and impediment to the free use of his will.
Well, it's interesting,
So
Father,
please
with what you're saying with that. I was thinking, here we are in the midst, basically, of World Youth Day happening in Poland. And of course, St. Faustina in her diary talks about the idea of our Lord coming to someone maybe at the point of death and actually asking three times for them to accept him at the last moment. So certainly I think, a Catholic perspective on that, and the idea that the prodigal son's father, the father is always there waiting and offering to the very last moment to offer that kind of mercy, right?
Yes, I believe that. And I think his judgment, even if we make a wrong move, I do think his judgment does account for our freedom at the time we made the wrong move. And I don't think it's kind of definitive. So I do think there's hope for people who have committed suicide in the thralls of depression.
There's always hope, and there's always mercy, and we should always never despair and always keep asking our Lord for that. And we will see you next week when we'll talk about a little bit about what the church teaches about the Bible and science. So we'll see you then. Father Spitzer, and wonderful books and available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. We put them up there. Some of them we've talked about already. Other ones based on some of the wonderful series Father has done here on EWTN. And don't forget encore airings of this program, 10 p.m. Eastern, and that's on Thursday night, and then Sunday at 3 a.m. and 12 a.m. Pacific, and also on radio on Saturdays at noon here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network as well. So, and check us out on the website, and you also go get a podcast if you'd like. And so for Father Spitzer, I'm Doug Keck, inviting you to join us next week as once again we re-enter Father Spitzer's universe. Thank you. God bless.